How many years were you posted in Moscow?
Well, I was posted not as ambassador, but overall 11 years in the Soviet Union, 4 different times.
4 different times.
Between 1961 and 1991.
You were fascinated with that part of the world. Why?
Well, several reasons. One, I was fascinated at first by Russian culture. And also, when I graduated from college in 1950, the big foreign policy problem for the United States was the Soviet Union. And I decided that, and, you know, I was very worried about the possibilities of nuclear war. And I thought that this is a relationship that must be managed. And I'd like to equip myself to be part of that management. And so I specialized actually in Russian literature and Soviet studies, and then spent 35 years in the Foreign Service, much of it dealing with the Soviet Union.
You were in Moscow, we discussed earlier, during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, I was.
Translating the cables between Khrushchev and President Kennedy. Did you think we were going to go to war?
No.
Why not?
It was very clear that they were not prepared for war.
The Russians?
The Russians, yes. And that they didn't want it, and they were much weaker than we were at that time. It was a very reckless thing for Khrushchev to put the missiles in Cuba, but of course we had put missiles in Turkey, and as far as he was concerned, this was sort of payback time, and he wanted to put pressure on us to leave Berlin. That was his objective. But we knew he would back down, we thought, and I think we were probably more complacent than we should have been, because we've learned later that if we had bombed those sites, that they did not need Moscow's approval to launch the missiles. So some colonel could have taken out Miami. And at the time, we could not imagine that they didn't have more control over the nuclear weapons. And we in the embassy assumed that Khrushchev would back down if Kennedy was firm enough. So we were all for making him back down. We also noticed that they did not tell the Soviet people what was really going on. There was no mention of nuclear weapons in the domestic propaganda. The stories were simply new American provocations against Cuba. So clearly he was not playing this up as, you know, a nuclear confrontation. So I think we were absolutely confident that there would not be a war. We were probably overconfident. There might have been. I think the risk was greater than we thought.
You also found yourself in a moment of history as well, because my understanding is you were there when Lee Harvey Oswald sought repatriation to the United States.
I issued his wife's visa. And the thing is, he had defected and had come to the embassy and asked to renounce his American citizenship. Now, the consul followed the book and said, you know, that's a serious thing. Sleep on it, come back tomorrow. He never came back. And therefore, he had not renounced his citizenship, and therefore he applied for a passport. We checked with the State Department. They say, yeah, he's still a citizen. Then it turned out he was married, and then they had a baby. And then he didn't have the money to go back, so actually he got a repatriation loan. But then, of course, once for a long time, the Russians wouldn't let him leave, but they finally got fed up with him. And he came in, and I was the visa officer. I issued his wife's visa. One of the interesting things that came out in the Warren Commission, she lied to me about her Komsomol membership. And I knew she had to have been a member because she, you know, at school, but she said, no, she was never a member, and she had some cock and bull story that, well, she was absent the day they took them in, and she never had to. And I wrote a note on it. She's lying, but it was involuntary. She didn't hold an office, therefore it would not be it would not be disqualifying. And I actually wrote all of this on the application. Later, the Warren Commission looked at this and said, you know, this is one of the evidence that the KGB did not send Oswald back because the KGB knew very well what our rules were. And they would have said, don't deny it. You know, say, yes, I was in the Komsomol, because the Americans consider that involuntary.
And that group was?
But Oswald had told her, she said later, to lie. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I put this note was used as evidence by the Warren Commission. among other evidence, that he was not actually sent back by the KGB.
Was he in that room with? Did you eyeball him? Did you get a?
Oh yes, he was not in the room. He tried to stay in the room during my interview, and I insisted he leave. And first he refused. He was. He had a way of offending everybody. He was real. He had a Napoleonic complex. He thought he was a great man, and nobody appreciated this. And finally, I kept saying, it has to be a private interview. And he said, well, she doesn't speak English. And I said, okay, it's going to be in Russian. He just sat. And I finally picked down the file and started working with something else. He said, when are you going to interview her? And I said, when you leave the room. And he left the room. My wife, she had heard about him, and she had come into the waiting room just to get a glimpse of him. They had a baby, which was still swaddled and on a board. And he came out and he slammed the baby down, on the sofa, and then began to pace. And I think he wanted to sit in the room to make sure that she did lie to me, thinking that I would use this to somehow to disqualify her visa.
We only have about 2 minutes left here. When you saw him on the television in Dallas, what went through your mind?
I was in Ghana when the assassination occurred. Of course, it was a shock. The first word we got, the President of the United States has been assassinated. And I was asked as a political officer at embassy in Ghana to go and notify some of our people. That evening, it was already evening there. We had no idea. We knew it happened in Dallas. We had no idea who it was.
And when you saw him, we only have about 35 seconds here. When you saw him on TV, did you recognize him right away?
We didn't have TV, but I heard VOA, and we heard a report that a man with a Russian wife had been arrested, whose name was Lee Harvey Oswald. I turned to my wife and said, my God, and he could have done it.
We have to, Mr. Ambassador, you have witnessed history, you've participated, and we're honored to have had you here to tell now that story, but also let us understand U.S.-Russian relations over the years, and we thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
My pleasure. And we thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Thank you, sir.